topic today is, if we are agile, why do we need managers? And before I go through the topic introduction and our presenter introduction, let me just quickly cover the usual logistics. We'll have about 45 minutes or so for the presentation that we'll cover, and then we'll leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for question and answers. But I will take some questions along the way, so if you have questions, do feel free to keep sending them into the Q&A panel of GoToWebinar, and I'll keep filtering these questions, those that warrant to be taken along the flow. I'll bring those up with Ron, our presenter, and otherwise other questions we'll queue them up for the end. So that's the general plan. We'll make the document and the recording available also on our website after the session is done today. With that, let me introduce the topic. So the topic is, if we are agile, why do we need managers? And most of you know that this is a common misconception that has been around since agile adoption, that agile managers in agile organizations are agile relies on self-managing teams, so why do we really need managers if people are self-managing? And many organizations often end up with expectations from managers that are transitioning, which are sometimes incompatible with the agile values. So this is a real challenge in real world. And agile has shifted the old roles and responsibilities as companies have transformed to agile, and those managers who are bent on command and control are clearly a barrier to agile adoption. Most of us recognize that. But then managers who take a hands-off completely approach, or are just kind of treading water in a sea of ambiguity, will almost certainly also come in the way of adoption of agile. So we got to figure out what's the right balance, and that's why we have the topic today. And I'm delighted to have Ron Lichty. He's written a book on this topic and been a practitioner to cover this topic with us. Ron has been alternating between consulting and managing software development team directly in various software product organizations for 25 years or so. And in all those cases, he spends his time untangling the knots in software development and transforming from chaos to clarity. And the last 15 years or so, of course, has been focused around agile. He has worked with large Fortune 500 type companies as well as tiny startups, so he has a range of experience to share and draw upon. And he's written a book. He's written books rather, and his most recent book is Managing the Unmanageable: Rules, Tools, and Insights for Managing Software People and Teams. It's published by Addison Wesley and has been compared by reviewers to software development classics that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, The Mythical Man Month or The Peopleware. With that, let me turn it over to Ron to cover this topic for us, and I'm sure all of you will have a bunch of questions, so I'm just excited to have this topic as a webinar topic with us. So over to you, Ron.
All right, thank you, Hemant. So I'm Ron Lichty, and we're going to be talking about, if we're agile, why do we need managers? I'll give you a little bit more context for me. So I've been at, these are some of the companies I've been with. I was originally a software engineer with one of these companies. I wrote embedded microcontroller applications. I wrote compiler code generators. I wrote entertainment and multimedia software. I wrote early word processing software. I did client-server applications, almost all of it in the world of waterfall. I got a few patents, and I wrote 2 books on programming, and I thought I had the best job in the whole world, except that I was in a 2-person company. I was really interested in what it meant to manage, and in a 2-person company there are no managers. And I had one other company that I wanted to work for. My dream company 25 years ago came knocking with an opportunity to be a manager. My dream company was Apple Computer, and I went to Apple 25 years ago to manage, and I've been managing and consulting around management is what I've done at all the rest of these companies and a few more. Some very large companies and some very tiny ones. I've managed product and development organizations at every level, from directly managing a few people to director and VP and CTO roles. 4 years ago, I looked back and realized that almost all of my career in management had been focused on transforming chaos to clarity. I determined to 4 years ago to begin consulting full-time, to take on interim VP engineering and acting CTO roles, and to become an Agile change agent. It turns out that untangling the nuts in software development and making software development hum made me an easy mark for Agile when I first came across it when I was at Charles Schwab in 1999. I really became enamored with Scrum when I first encountered it in 2002, and I've been managing XP and Scrum teams for something like over a decade. And I've been training teams in Scrum starting over half a dozen years ago, from training teams from early stage startups to multinational hardware companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about managers in software development generally before diving into managers and Agile. This is the book I wrote. We wrote our book for people managers, so managers directly managing programmers doing software development. And what we discovered in talking to group after group of programmers and managers is that barely half of managers have had a single day of training in managing, and barely 5% have had even one day of those days of training before becoming a manager. Isn't it odd how long we expect programmers to have studied the art of programming and how little we expect managers to have studied the art of managing? I led a session at Agile Open in 2013 on critical Agile manager roles, and we ended up with 3 breakout groups charged with identifying critical roles and impediments for managers in Agile. All 3 of those groups, every one of those groups came back and identified the lack of training of managers as an enormous gap, not just a gap for managing Agile teams, but a gap in managing in general, and a liability to the success of Agile. For my co-author and me, and this was in part true for us, we were both smart programmers who were tapped to become managers without having a lick of training. We had to learn it on our own. It's also a primary reason why my co-author and I wrote Managing the Unmanageable. We discovered the hard way that there's very little out there in the way of books specific to managing programmers. There are a ton of books on project management of every flavor. There are a ton of books on Agile. There are a ton of books on Scrum. There are a ton of books on XP. There are plenty of books on general purpose managing. There's almost nothing specific to managing programmers and programming teams. And then there's management training with regard to Agile. I don't know whether this is something uniquely American, but I found it interesting. Dean Leffingwell talked to a group of us here in the Bay Area a couple of years ago. Dean said something toward the end of his talk about lean in manufacturing. He was talking about factories in Asia that want to move their process to lean. Who do you think, now think about this, who do you think they send, that factories in Asia send to training first? They send their managers to training first. Now think about the training that you've done. So working with a lot of companies, I know that some of you have had training and some of you who are doing Agile have not. But think about those of you who've had training, who did you send to training? In general, I find that sending managers to training is an afterthought. It's the teams that get sent to training. But Dean Leffingwell was pointing out that when factories in Asia move to lean, they start with their managers. And how long do you think they send managers to training for? So think about the most training. Think about the most training that you encounter, that you've ever had in any company you've ever worked in. My experience is that occasionally there's a week of training in something. More often there's 2 days or 1 day or even a half-day training in something. So Dean reported that managers are sent off to training for lean in manufacturing for a minimum of 2 weeks, and often as long as 6 weeks. Think about that relative to the training that you've done in Agile. I'm guessing that your teams haven't had more than 2 or 3 days of training in Agile for the most part. So let's take a look at managers in Agile. You've probably observed what I have about management, what Hemant pointed out at the beginning. When we're doing Agile, we talk about self-organizing teams, but management doesn't just go away. I attended a presentation by a couple of engineers from Spotify. So probably the videos or the writing about Agile, there's probably more of us who have looked at Spotify because of Henrik Nieberg's videos and white papers on Scrum. The guys from Spotify were pointing out that 25% of Spotify employees are in a role considered to be management. And yet, take a look at the standard canonical Scrum drawing. This is the drawing that when those of us who train teams in Agile may draw what the team looks like. We draw in a Scrum Master, we draw in a product owner, we draw in the team, we sometimes draw in business owners or stakeholders, and where's the manager? Have you ever had a Scrum trainer who drew the picture of a team and drew in a manager? Managers are never mentioned. Here's another canonical drawing that I pulled off of the web. We've got a Scrum Master, a product owner, a UI lead. We've broken the team out into developers and testers and technical writers, and again, there's no manager. So what's the result? Our managers are left with their hands in their pockets, or they're left scratching their heads trying to figure out what their role is, even as their managers are everything. Agile has changed everything for managers. It changes the definition of leadership, it changes their jobs, it changes the makeup and organization and relationships of their teams. It changes their interactions with the rest of the organization. It changes who their peers are and their partners are, and yet managers are not even given Agile training that defines a role for them. So I'm going to jump for a second to point out one of the things that we gathered. My co-author, Mickey Mantle, and I began developing our book, Managing the Unmanageable, because we had been having breakfast with each other for a decade and talking about the challenges of managing software developers and passing rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom back and forth over a breakfast table. And rules of thumb are useful in that they let us point out to our managers that we didn't just make this stuff up. So let me give you a few examples of rules of thumb. So measure twice, cut once is a rule of thumb that's been around for hundreds of years. It dates from the period of Ben Franklin. And it wasn't one of Ben Franklin's, but does it apply to software development? Absolutely. The NASA Mars Orbiter software developers wished that they had measured twice before they sent units of measure in English units to a satellite that they had programmed in metric and caused it to plunge, instead of to go into orbit around Mars, to plunge through the Mars atmosphere. This is another rule of thumb that dates from that same period, hundreds of years ago. Life is simpler when you plow around the stump. Now, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and this is a rule of thumb that I particularly like. It's definitely true for farmers, but it's also true for those of us in software development. Our organizations often have sticky spots in the organization that it's a lot simpler to plow around than to try to take out those. Here's a rule of thumb that is specific to Agile. Pair programming for half an hour during an interview will save everyone's time. This one came from David Vidra at testdriven.com. And in fact, when we're interviewing programmers, this is a truism. It's a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb that both Mickey Mantle, my co-author, and I collected, both of us collected very early in our careers, was Brooks' Law. Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. Most managers, I suspect, have the mythical man month on their bookshelves. And as I said, rules of thumb let us point out to our managers that we didn't just make this stuff up. Brooks' Law dates from the 1970s. This rule of thumb, adding manpower to a late software project makes it later, has been around for 50 years and is as true today as it was 50 years ago. When it comes to managers in Agile, we need ammunition like rules of thumb, and so I'm going to scatter some rules of thumb around Agile through this morning's webinar. there's a fundamental reason we need to talk about management, and it's as fundamental for the non-managers as it is for the managers. And so here's a rule of thumb from Mike Cohn, Mike was one of the first half dozen Agile and Scrum guys and was a co-founder of the Agile Alliance and Scrum Alliance and co-taught the first Scrum Master class, who said a common misconception is that because of this reliance on self-organizing teams, there's little or no role for leaders of Agile teams. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I said that management doesn't just go away. So rather than ask the question, why do we need managers, I think we need to answer the question, what's the role to leverage managers to make our Agile teams and transformations successful? Frankly, it's subtle. The fundamental challenges for managers don't change. Mickey and I wrote 9 chapters around the 300 rules of thumb that we embedded in our book. And these chapters we covered why programmers are hard to manage, why we're unique to manage, how we programmers are unique not only from other groups but from each other, how to recruit and interview and hire programmers, how to avoid losing hires between the offer and their first day, and how to onboard new programmers not just into the company but in how to manage your people, how to manage your boss, how to manage your peers, and the challenge of managing yourself. What motivates teams to achieve greatness? What differentiates exceptional programming and product cultures, and the goal line, ensuring functionality gets started, coded, completed, and shipped? And really in Agile, that last one is really the only one that changes dramatically. But that said, there are roles that managers, teams still need us to play. There are roles that change, sometimes dramatically. There are pre-Agile roles and styles that are truly inappropriate. There are roles that are deprecated, and there are roles that are new with Agile. There are a lot of observations I could share about managers in Agile from a decade and a half with Agile and a decade managing Agile teams and half a decade training teams and organizations and managers in Agile, but I've selected these 7 topics because I think somebody needs to do these things, and they are crucial roles to our teams. They're crucial roles to success. So let's start off with creating an Agile culture. Managing software development is just catching up to management theory from the 1960s. In our book, we briefly pulled 3 famous management theories in. I imagine all of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow wrote that in the 1940s. A second one was McGregor's XY theory. Douglas McGregor in 1960 wrote a book called The Human Side of Enterprise, and this is the drawing from our book. The authoritarian approach was theory X management. There's been hundreds of years of industrial revolution thinking that said that managers should be authoritarian, repressive, and do micromanagement and do those kinds of things. And McGregor came along in the 1950s and in 1960 and turned management on its head and said our role as managers is in the new world, in the world that was emerging in 1960. Our role is to support our staff. McGregor used words like enabling and empowering and developmental and continuous improvement. Isn't it interesting that those are some of the words that Agile uses to describe its word for managers, servant leaders? Isn't it interesting that it took 40 to 50 years in the advent of Agile for software development to catch up to McGregor? Let me share another nugget of wisdom with you. Here's Alan Shalloway of Net Objectives, who's been a leader in lean thinking and agile thinking for decades. Shalloway says, lean agile management is the art of leading people, not managing them. Leading people involves creating the correct environment, focusing them on the right things, and trusting them to do their work. In Lead Agile, the manager has 2 primary responsibilities: setting the outcomes or goals expected of the team, and assisting the doers in creating a better process and workspace to get their jobs done. I heard it phrased at an Agile Open conference I attended a few years ago Management sets the boundaries of what needs to be done and says to the team, I trust you to figure out how to get it done. Management is about trusting your people and your team. There are a couple of rules of thumb that from our book that I really like. The first of those is trust but verify. Yes,
Ron, can we, before we move off that topic, can we take one short question? Would you have used the term leaders and managers and management so far? Can you clarify if you see a distinction in the role of a leader versus a manager?
Yeah, and actually, Hemant, in our book we call out 3 roles, not just manager and leader, but also coach. And we believe that a great manager must be all 3 of those things. A manager deals with administration and process. A coach trains and mentors their people, and a leader provides guidance and vision. So the coaching standpoint, you as a manager needs to get to know each of your programmers as much as you can possibly do, understanding what makes them tick, understanding what they do outside of work, setting goals, reviewing progress toward meeting those goals, mentoring into their learning, sharing your hard-won experience with them, providing them with clear feedback, finding learning opportunities for them to learn, giving them career guidance, teaching them new skills, modeling teamwork and leader interactions and character values, and caring about them. Leadership is, as I said, is about providing guidance and vision, and leadership requires courage. It requires us as managers to have consciences and to be able to go with our conscience and to have internal conviction and the willingness to stand alone and to be personally vulnerable and to empower people and support them and get out of their way and create environments where ideas and relationships and adventure flourish. So followers really need direction and trust and hope from their leaders.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, that is very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
So I was saying that there are 2 rules of thumb that I really like, and some of you, maybe many of you, recognize who said this: trust but verify. But I'll bet that most of you don't know who said it originally. Ronald Reagan was actually quoting a Russian proverb that was frequently spouted by Vladimir Lenin. The thing that I like about trust but verify is that it is the imperative not to micromanage. It is the essence of delegation. It's about setting expected outcomes for teams and then getting out of their way to do that. And a second rule of thumb that I think is similar is one that I heard from Alan Lefkoff, who was president and CEO of Natopia for many years, and who told me that he had heard it first from Lou Gerstner when both of them, Lou Gerstner was later the CEO of IBM. Both Lou and Alan were at McKinsey. I inspect what I expect. We're still talking about creating an agile culture, about management in software development and management in Agile that has to do with improving the process and the environment to support outstanding work. And really, that starts with communication. It starts with creating a culture of communication at every level. Communication is fundamental to software development. Unlike many of our organizations, which are led by salespeople, sales is a real culture of heroes, but software development is a culture of teams. Kimberly Weefling, I heard this first from Kimberly Weefling. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in this ratio. But when I went exploring it, it turns out that this rule of thumb is thousands of years old. It was originally said by Greek philosophers thousands of years ago. And it's one that is really useful for all of us as we try to create agile organizations. My own rule of thumb around communication is that in software development, we cannot over-communicate. I think it's possible for salespeople to over-communicate. I think it's possible for marketing people to over-communicate. I think it's really rare for software development organizations to over-communicate. And then when we get to virtual teams, when we get to distributed teams, when we get to teams that are split across geographies, there's never enough communication. It requires an absolute commitment to communicate. A rule of thumb from Ted Young, a development manager here in the Bay Area, said the more distance between teammates, the more you have to formalize communication and make that communication explicit. We devoted an entire chapter in our book to creating culture, and around approaches to take. It begins with understanding your corporate culture. So I want you to think about software cultures and the culture that we need to create for our teams, and those cultures live within our corporate cultures. Very rarely are they the same as they appear to be at Spotify, from all of what all of us have been reading about Spotify and from what I heard from them the other night. Most corporate cultures derive from CEOs who were people. Sales is a sport of individual heroes, and software development is a team sport, and so we can't always leverage everything in the corporate culture, but we need to leverage what we can. I was at Schwab for 7 years between 1996 and 2002, and Schwab has an excellent set of values. They have values around teamwork and striving and responsiveness, and that teamwork one is really useful to leverage. But when we have values like striving and responsiveness, they added up to relentless delivery, and relentless delivery leads programmers to essentially wear blinders and not share with each other and not find common ways to do things. So we need to protect our teams from those parts of the corporate culture that are counterproductive, and add what we need to create powerful culture that supports and enables high-performance teamwork. So we've talked about creating an Agile culture. We also need to support Agile values. I joined the authorship team of the study for product team performance in 2013. This is an annual study that we do, and there's a URL at the bottom where we've got a survey out there now. We invite all of you who are on this call to who are on product teams to go take the survey. You'll find the survey at the top of that URL. In 2012, the first year of the study, that very first year, the study had asked respondents to self-identify for their teams, whether their teams were based on waterfall or based on Agile or based on some blend of waterfall and Agile or based on lean. Resulted in an Agile adoption curve that was really interesting. It showed that actually a big jump in Agile adoption between 2012 and 2013, a big fall in waterfall usage between 2012 and 2013. It showed that there are more teams using a blend of Agile and waterfall than anything else. What we did in 2013, the year after that first query about what people were using, we asked it a really interesting question. We asked the question, which method do you think is likeliest to improve the profitability of your product? And then we cross-correlated the results. So down the left-hand side is the methodology that people used. So down the left-hand side, people were using Agile or blended or lean or waterfall, or they didn't know. And then across in each row, so if we look at the first row, here's the people who are using Agile, and 74% of them believe that Agile would make their product more profitable. Not a surprise. The people who are using blended, more of them than not, in that second row, more of them than not believe that blended makes their product more profitable. And then if they were going to choose something else, the 32% of them almost thought that Agile would make it more profitable. The folks who are using Lean more often than not believe that Lean will make their product more profitable. The interesting thing is that those people using Waterfall basically said, to make my product more profitable, give me anything but Waterfall. The fact is, so why is that? Why might that be? The Agile principles begin, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer. And I'm going to contend to you that, in fact, what defines success is going beyond the Agile principles. Not just our highest priority is to satisfy the customer, but making our highest priority to delight the customer. And how do we do that? Agile practices. Agile practices do deliver value. If we look at many of the Agile practices, planning daily, planning every single sprint, planning publicly, transparently, ordering our work based on customer value, so that when we pull from the backlog, we as a team always know that we're working on the highest customer value. They're defining what it means to be done for every story, and delivering frequently, delivering increments of the product every single sprint, sharing how we're doing, and reflecting on how to do better. Every one of those practices delivers value. To give you an example of one of them, stand-ups matter. We, in the 2015 study of product team performance, we asked teams about stand-ups. It's difficult to say what leads to something else, what causes something else. Causation's tricky, but we can for sure say that there's a correlation, that those teams that reported that they had the highest performance also reported that they had effective daily stand-ups. Agile practices do deliver value. Voting machines, and I'm going to shift to an analogy here for a moment. Voting machines deliver value too, but nobody claims that voting machines are what make us a democracy. In fact, all of us know countries that have voting machines that are not democracies. Voting machines are just tools to help us be more effective at being a democracy. Similarly, Agile practices don't by themselves make us Agile. Agile seems easy. It has practices. Waterfall always seemed easy, and we tend to latch on to practices, I think, because we come from a waterfall world where waterfall was basically a set of practices. It was straightforward, it was very linear, it was very concrete, it has phase gates, it's prescribed, and so we can latch onto practices, and the practices deliver value. But Agile is hard because it's not just practices. Agile is a philosophy. What's hard is breathing life into the practices, into making them your own, into adapting the practices to the uniqueness of teams and your people and your culture and your products. Mike Cohn said, becoming Agile is hard. It's harder than most other organizational change efforts I've witnessed or been part of, for reasons that include the need to avoid turning Scrum into a list of best practices. It's Agile values and Agile principles that make us Agile. The Agile values and principles come from agilemanifesto.org, and if you haven't been there, you need to go there. These are the values that are called out on agilemanifesto.org. They were called out in 2001 when the group of Agilists got together and came up with the word Agile as an umbrella term for Scrum and XP and Lean and Kanban and Crystal and some other approaches to doing software development. We value, these are the things we value, and similarly at agilemanifesto.org/principles.html, here are the principles that we use to to think about this, and there's that principle. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. There are 12 principles there that we need to value the Agile Manifesto over our sets of practices. It's the manifesto that counts. It's the values that count. It's the principles that count, not just the practices. And it's incumbent on all of us on our teams to value the values and to value the principles. And it is particularly useful particularly critical role for managers who live outside the teams but set the expectations of what teams need to accomplish. Managers have opportunity and leverage to call our teams back from badly performing practices or performing practices well but blindly to engaging deeply with the values and the spirit of Agile. It's Agile principles that make us Agile, and I'm going to pull out from those 12 principles. Here are 5: building projects around motivated individuals, trusting our people to get the job done, working with face-to-face conversations, developing self-organizing teams, teams that reflect and tune and adjust. Managers need to support Agile values. So a third role that managers need to take on is empowering self-organization and excellence. So what is a self-organizing team? If our self-organizing team were not in software but we're an acting troupe, what kind of acting would we do? I'm hoping that most of you have the word improv on your lips. If our self-organizing team were a music group, what kind of music do we perform? Again, I'm hoping that most of you have free jazz as a thought. So who's the leader in an improv group? Who's the leader in a free jazz combo? In fact, everyone in an improv troupe, everyone in a free jazz combo are the leaders. And how is it that leadership passes back and forth among the team? How is it that it needs to pass back and forth on our software teams, on our Agile teams? It passes back and forth by all of us listening to each other. Whether we're leading or whether we're following, we need to be listening. That leadership passes in a jazz group. All of you have at some point, I'm sure, listened to free jazz and realized that all of the musicians are listening to each other. They're listening for when is it my turn to lead, and then when they're leading, they're listening for when is it that someone else has taken the leadership and moved on from what I've been doing. And it's exactly the same in software development, and that's a really hard challenge to all of us. It challenges all of us on our software teams to step up and to be part of that self-organizing team. Esther Derby said, when teams self-organize, there's still plenty for managers to do. A manager's job is to engineer the organization so that teams can do their best work. It's just that we've been so busy running teams that we didn't have time to empower them. Since I began training teams in Agile 7 or 8 years ago, I think that very first training I got asked this question: are there projects that are not suitable for Agile? And I pondered that a lot for a bunch of years, and I thought, well, maybe embedded software, it's it's tied to hardware. Hardware's got more of a waterfall aspect to it. I have since been training teams, software teams in hardware organizations, and discovered that embedded software is absolutely as suitable for Agile as anything else. The answer to this question, it turned out I have kicked myself because it was staring me in the face. In fact, it's not projects that are not suitable for Agile. I believe it's organizations that are not suitable for Agile, and those are organizations that are micromanaged. Micromanagement disrupts Agile. Micromanagement prevents teams from becoming best teams. It prevents teams from learning. It causes teams to become order takers rather than self-organized teams. Agile calls for everyone on the team to step up. Micromanagement causes everyone to step back. As managers, we need to be aware not only of the things that motivate, but the things that demotivate. One of my early ahas as a manager was that motivating people is not just about what motivates them, but also what demotivates them. This is, I said that we brought 3 thinkers on motivation into our book and management into our book. The third of those was a guy named Frederick Hertzberg, who in the 1950s did some seminal work that was written up in the Harvard Business Review in the 1980s, and in fact, the article that was written up in the 1980s is the most reprinted article of all time from the Harvard Business Review. Hertzberg said that there are not just things that well, one of the things he said is that there are fewer things that motivate than we think. Money's not a big motivator, provided that we're paying people enough, and that sort of goes with Maslow as well, where we've got this hierarchy of needs. Just need to be aware, though, that there are not only things that motivate, but there are things that demotivate. So this is not Hertzberg's graph. This is a graph that Mickey and I did for the book, and there are several of them there, that Hertzberg did his work on all workers across all industries, knowledge work, not knowledge work, all those kinds of things. We tried to hone it for the things that motivate for programmers. And we believe, and this is not far off from Hertzberg, but I think it's specific to programmers, we believe that the highest motivator for programmers is making a difference in the world. This is incumbent upon us as managers to make the connection between what it is, what our company's mission is, and the difference that it makes in the world, and the work that the people that our teams are making and that each of the individuals on our teams are making. To be able to see that the work I'm doing is making a difference in the world is huge. That second bar there, the second blue bar, so the blue bars are motivators, the red bars are demotivators, causes of dissatisfaction. The second highest motivator is learning and growing, and it's incumbent upon us as managers to ensure that our teams have the opportunities to learn and grow, that our programmers have the opportunity to learn and grow. The third one is toys and technology, and I'm not going to say much more about that. But the fourth one is recognition and praise. It's incumbent upon us as managers to ensure that we're recognizing and praising great behavior and behavior that's consistent with the culture that we're trying to create. And the fifth one there is having fun, and if we don't create fun environments, we know that our people will leave. And it's only when we get to the sixth one, upside, that we begin to see anything related to money. As I said, Dan Pink in his book, I think it was called Drive, pointed out that money is really not a very good motivator. Provided that people are paid enough, increments of money are not big motivators compared to making a difference in the world and learning and growing and toys and technology and recognition and praise and having fun. Now the flip side of this is, and this is what Hertzberg was pointing out, is that there are demotivators, and there's what we believe is the number one demotivator. The highest red bar on that chart is respect for supervisor. That's us. If our folks, there's a rule of thumb in HR that people don't leave companies, they leave managers. The second, notice that they're the second and third red bars, and you have to flip the words, but if people aren't having fun and they aren't learning and growing, they're likely to be dissatisfied and leave our companies. The fourth and fifth ones I think are really interesting because those are working conditions and company policies and administration. So to see the truth of this, Hertzberg's work, nobody, I've never met a programmer who said, oh yeah, I joined this company because of its policies and administration. But I've known programmers who have left because of their frustration with company policies and administration. So these are things that managers need to think about and need to be aware of, that there are not only things that motivate, but things that demotivate. So we've talked about it, creating an Agile culture, about supporting Agile values, about empowering self-organization and excellence. And the fourth one that I'm going to touch on briefly is scaling Scrum. We're responsible as managers for creating organizations that are consistent with Agile and consistent with Scrum. When we've only got one team, and some of you are probably in startups that have only one team is pretty easy. 7 plus or minus 2, anywhere from 5 to 9 programmers and testers and maybe a writer or architect on your team or visual designer on your team. That's pretty easy. It's when we get to multiple teams and we need to rethink the traditional structure of component-based organizational design and think about feature-based organizational design. Feature teams that include all of the folks who are on all of those teams. It is, in fact, one of the things that the folks from Spotify, here's a picture of the Spotify stuff from Nieberg. Nieberg calls his team squads, and the component teams, the database developers, are chapters that are led by managers. And it turns everything on its side, and we need to think about our organizational design. I don't think there's time here this morning to talk much more about organizational design, but this is a management role, and in addition to that is layering on guilds or communities of practice. Spotify calls them guilds. These are it's not just the people who are on the database team who are interested in databases. It's not just the people who are on the web development team who are interested in web development. These are our communities of practice, and as managers, it's an opportunity to make sure that the communities of practice happen as well by sponsoring them. Removing impediments is the fifth role that I'm calling out for managers. Now, this is an interesting one because all of you know, and this is probably going to bollocks a few of you, because we all know that removing impediments is the Scrum Master's job, right? Well, here's Diana Larson, who points out managers are still needed, not so much for their planning and controlling ability, but for the important job of interfacing on the team's behalf with the rest of the organization. The fact is that managers are much better placed in most organizations to do impediment removal at the organizational level. We have more clout than most Scrum Masters have. We have more leverage. We have unique visibility. We can't see as many trees, but we can see a lot more forest. And we've got a lot to contribute in removing impediments. In fact, there are a couple of traditional management rules that are fundamentally impediment removal. One of those is being a damper to the noise, as CTO Joe Kleinschmidt put it. Frankly, regardless of how well we've done it, I think most of us have recognized this role in our organizations. Particularly large organizations, there's a torrent of politics, of opportunities, of distractions, of issues that have always been a threat to our teams, that sap our team's focus. The problem with most Agile transformations is that our organizations mostly think that Agile is a development thing, it's a product group thing. It's certainly not a thing for the whole organization. And the result of that is that there's a heck of a lot of noise in the rest of the organization to damp. HR wants us to review our people as individuals. The organization rewards individual measures of contribution, disregarding the destructive force that ranking individuals has on teams. In lean times, we see executives decreeing layoffs take the form of haircuts to every team. And in good times, they seem to only see the heroism and not the day after day teamwork that got the project done. As managers, we have to be vigilant to damp the noise coming from the rest of our organizations. Another specific is that we need to become the guardians of Slack. Software development is much like traffic. The road on the right is 100% utilized and has come to a virtual standstill. The road on the left, because it has Slack, the traffic is moving rapidly. Managers need to understand that headroom is critical to throughput, that the end goal is not keeping employees busy every minute, it's delivering value to customers.
So Ron, can we take one question on this slide?
Yes.
So do you have any advice for managers in this audience? How much Slack is optimal or appropriate? How much is too much? And then, of course, as you pointed out, if there's no Slack, that's not good for sure. So what's your advice on how much Slack?
I think the useful thing, Hemant, is for managers to take their eye off of keeping people busy and taking their eye off of whether it's the whole butts in seats and they're going to get, and all of us get pressure from our organizations to, why aren't your people showing up at 9 o'clock and nobody's around to see them working at midnight. We need to take our eye off of whether people are working, and we need to focus on delighting customers. If we look at it from a lean standpoint and we look at it from a flow standpoint, the second that we see somebody who has Slack and we say, and we give them something to do, now we have redirected their efforts and we've put them in a different context than maybe the one that they need to be in. If we just left them with the Slack so that when the other members of their team finished, they could pick it up, we too often block flow by keeping people busy. There's no easy answer to this.
Good. Great. Thanks.
The other thing is that we need to be crossing guards to protect our teams and team members from multitasking. And that's really part of that answer I was giving to you, Hemant, on Slack. As Scott McNeely at Sun used to say, we need to keep all our arrows going in the same direction. The cost of multitasking is enormous. The cost of context switching. I often ask programmers, how long does it take you to, when you come in the morning, to prepare to write the next line of code? And I get answers that range from, well, some people, it takes them 10 minutes to assemble all of the places in their head where this logic or this algorithm might touch, or this part of this next line of code might touch, in order to write that next line of code. And some people will give answers as much as a half an hour or even longer. If it takes you 20 minutes to assemble all of the stuff to write the next line of code, and you get interrupted every 19 minutes, how many lines of code, how many lines of good code do you end up writing in the day? Guarding against guarding against interruptions, guarding against the torrent of politics and interruptions, guarding against multitasking are fundamental roles for managers. I'm going to briefly talk about two traditional roles: counseling, coaching, and mentoring. And the reason, counseling, coaching, and mentoring are fundamental. They shouldn't change, right? I mean, managers have always had the responsibility to counsel and coach and mentor. So I've given a task to groups of managers. I've given them a list of 50 management responsibilities that are traditional management responsibilities. They're actually on this GoToWebinar as a handout, and you can get them. You'll be able to get them from the web page where the final recording and slides are after the webinar. When I've given the real surprise to me when managers filled that out, and I asked them the question, so for these 50 roles, do they change a lot or do they change a little? The big surprise was this one. There were a lot of managers who said, this changes a lot with Agile. And it was a real surprise to me because I always felt that this was a traditional role. And what they said to me was, I never had time to mentor my people. I was so focused on delivering that with Agile, when the team takes over the focus on delivery, I now have the time to grow my people's skills and to coach their careers. So in my opinion, this is one that never should have changed at all, but it was one of the ones that managers think changes the most. We fundamentally, here's a picture that I'm not sure whether this is about counseling and coaching and mentoring or whether these two girls are really pair programming, but I really like the photograph. I think that we have a responsibility to counsel and coach and mentor our people. And finally, hiring and firing. The rule of thumb that Mickey and I have always had around hiring has been always be recruiting. Mickey and I have considered recruiting in long discussions that we've had. We realize that we consider recruiting to be a manager's most important job. Frankly, if managers are successful, then the rest of their jobs are easier, and what happens on teams is magic. If they're unsuccessful with a single hire, that single hire can be a plague on their team for months. It can demotivate your team. It can demoralize your organization. It can undermine a manager's leadership. It can incite dissension and strife. It can delay or derail deliverables, not to mention how hard it is to get rid of bad hires. Hiring is the single most difficult to undo decision that managers make. And when we do it wrong, we have to, and no manager makes it successfully through management, in my experience, without making a mistake once in a while. It has to be dealt with, because a problem employee in a team's midst, everybody on the team knows about it. It seems interminable to the other members of the team. They all know that there's a problem employee on their team, and they think either that their manager's an idiot for not seeing it, or that you're not doing your job. So how do we foster an Agile culture? We need to trust our people. We need to empower self-organization and excellence. We need to expect and enable truly shared leadership. We need to model and defend and evangelize Agile values. We need to foster a culture of communication. We need to encourage teamwork and collaboration. We need to shield our teams from politics and distraction. We need to take care of stuff and take care of our teams. Fundamentally, managers are critical to the success of Agile transformations and have key roles in making Agile successful every day. But it means that managers need to understand and own roles, some of which are new and some of which are very different from the roles that they played before. And we need to be proactive in becoming expert in Agile and in our roles in Agile and in applying them. So with that, let me note a couple of things. First, there's a 35% discount on that my publisher, Addison Wesley, has made available to all of you. And there's a URL there that you can take advantage of it. There's a handout that you can pull down with that same 35% discount code and URL on it. Secondly, you can participate in this year's study of product team performance. There's actually a $200 Apple gift certificate that we'll give out to somebody who's taken the survey, and you'll get early access to the results, which is probably more important for many of you. And it takes only 7 minutes to fill out the survey. the survey URL is at that ronlichty.com/study.html URL. And third, let me note that Jill and Hemant have posted 2 handouts, both here on GoToWebinar and on the web page, and the final, well, where the final recording will show up with the slides after the webinar. So with that, questions?
Thanks, Ron. This was excellent. I think we took some questions along the way, but unfortunately, given the barrier of time, I think we run through the end time of 1 o'clock Central Time. So I think we just have to postpone taking any questions. So we can always follow up with folks who have questions on this topic, and I'm sure many of you do separately. Okay. Through email and separate session. But I really appreciate you taking this time, and we look forward to, we have another webinar coming up next week. Maybe you can advance to next page. Yes. And the one after that, I'll skip. Yeah, this is the next week. So this is our scheduled webinar, and what we did today was actually a makeup webinar that we missed last month. So we're excited to have 2 webinars in a row now, and look forward to seeing many of you in the next month. And thanks again very much, Ron, for covering this great topic of role of managers in Agile. Okay.
You're welcome, and I'm signed up for